Cashflow King with you today, and in today's episode we have 10 personal finance money myths. Thanks so much for tuning into the show. As always, we really appreciate it. If you feel like we're doing a good job, please feel free to leave a 5-star rating or review. It really does help the show. Don't really have a lot today in the way of announcements, so I'm just going to jump right into today's episode, which is going to be on 10 personal finance money myths. Some of these, I'm going to have just a few comments. Some of them I might tell a little bit of a story. And I think there's one example in particular that I'm going to run through some numbers to bring that one to life. But these are just some things that you may have heard over the years from friends, family members, co-workers, even so-called gurus, personal finance, quote-unquote experts out there. And they're really not true, at least in my opinion, and in the opinion of really anybody that knows what the hell they're talking about. But there's definitely going to be some debates about some of these, and you may even disagree with some of these, and that's okay. And we welcome any feedback again to the show, and we're happy to correspond with you, and if needed, do a follow-up. Maybe even bring you on the show if you disagree with enough of them, or even if you don't, you want to come on the show. Email the show, realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. Side note here, I guess kind of an announcement. There's this one guy who has like this financial coaching program or business or whatever who emailed the show, and I went and I checked out his website and I took a look at what he had going on. And, you know, all these people want to get on the fucking show, right? But they're not premium. They won't buy the show a coffee. They won't, like, even just a few fucking dollars. It's hilarious to me. So I started blowing this guy up, and then I would just be like, hey, we recording today or what? We ask that you become a premium subscriber in order to get on the show, you know, and I would just resend the email to him multiple times. Haven't heard back from him since. So if they are bold enough to come at me cold, which is totally fine, and wanting to get on the show, but they don't want to engage or, you know, it's all about them and promoting their business or their coaching or whatever the fuck they got going on, and they don't want to throw the show a few bucks, then fuck them, and I'll spam them back. So I'm having some fun with that. Anyway, all right, let's get into the show here. So myth number one is, and we've talked about this on a prior episode, I actually searched the catalog to try to be able to point back to a specific episode, and I couldn't find it. It's probably baked into at least one, if not more, because I do remember talking about it, possibly with Cube Crusher at one point. But personal finance money myth number one, renting is just throwing money away. And I actually had this conversation, for those that have listened to the past couple of shows, I mentioned I had a meeting coming up that was a referral from an existing client, and there was a younger couple, and they wanted to talk about several different things, including essentially first-time home purchase. And during our conversation, that meeting has since transpired, this is essentially was essentially their thought process on the entire thing. You know, they're recently married, looking to start a family. They're currently renting. Their lease is coming up next year, and they are looking to take some steps potentially forward in the form of a home purchase. And while we talked some numbers and we dug into some different things, my advice to them was essentially, look, we can talk all day about the math and the numerical components, and we did. But I said, at the end of the day, you also have to realize that it's a very personal decision, and that you shouldn't necessarily feel like you need to, quote unquote, purchase a home because that's what's expected of you. And I actually asked that question at one point during the meeting. I said, how much of this is lifestyle decision and that's what you actually want versus how much of this is doing what you're, quote unquote, supposed to do, like we're all told, you know, to go to school, get a good education, get a good job, put money into retirement, buy a house, you know, all that sort of thing, right? And they admitted that it was basically a mixture of the two. Now, looking at their finances, I don't want to make this entire show about them, but just a couple quick things. They were doing some things that a lot of adults, even mid-career people and end-of-career people oftentimes don't do. And I've talked about this on the show before. I think we did a show one time on, I think we called it the tax triangle, a lifetime of financial flexibility, something like that. And we talked about the importance of having money in non-retirement accounts like taxable brokerage accounts. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that they had already started investing in that way, in addition to investing for their own retirement through their retirement plans at work. And so we talked about a whole bunch of stuff. But bottom line, strictly from a number standpoint, based on their liquidity and the price point they were looking at and those sorts of things, they're not really ready at this time. They probably won't even be ready by the time next year rolls around and their lease is up. And we had talked about some different options, as far as that goes. But I guess the idea that renting is throwing money away, as we've said on the show before, I don't necessarily think that's true. I think a lot of people like to talk about that. A lot of people take pride in home ownership, and there's nothing wrong with home ownership, but I still to this day really truly believe it is a lifestyle decision. And if that's what you choose to do, fine, but don't kid yourself into thinking it's an investment. Now, he hasn't been on the show in a while. I think he's going to come back at some point. But Cube Crusher is renting right now, and he made the comment, I'm not sure if he did this publicly on the show or at least to me in conversation before, that he never plans on purchasing again, more than likely. And that's a personal decision for him, but he doesn't really view renting as throwing money away. Now, I'm sure nobody likes to write the rent check, just like most people don't necessarily get excited about making a mortgage payment. But at the end of the day, I think home ownership is way overblown. There's the difference between, you can't just compare a rent payment versus a mortgage payment. There's much more to it than that in terms of total cost of ownership, with upkeep and maintenance and transaction costs and you name it. And so while I'm not trying to discourage anybody from owning a home, I don't think that if you're renting, you should look at that as throwing money away, because typically you have a lot more flexibility. Yes, you might be in a lease, for example, but you can still pivot if you wanted to. And in some cases, depending on, how the lease is structured, what it may cost you in terms of a penalty or something to get out of it, you could still pretty much move and not have to worry about listing a home on the market and having to deal with those transaction costs and the stress of having to deal with the listing agent and having the pictures taken and, is it furnished or not, and moving there's a lot of stress that goes along with buying and selling a personal residence as well. And so for those that, it fits their lifestyle and they want that flexibility, I think there's nothing wrong with renting, especially if you live in certain parts of the country where owning just might be cost prohibitive. And there's even personal finance experts out there. There's one in particular I think I might have alluded to or mentioned on the show before, who lives in New York City, and he rents, and he's a multimillionaire, and he chooses to rent, and he likes to shit on people that own. I'm not trying to do that or not do that. I'm just saying you need to make a decision that's right for you. But renting, think of it as part of that payment is going, at least in my opinion, to pay for optionality. It's not necessarily just flushing money down the toilet, because you're going to have a housing payment whether you rent or you own. And even if you own, whether you have a mortgage or not, right, you're still going to have taxes and ostensibly property insurance. And so there's always going to be that home payment in one way, shape, or form or another, regardless of the dollar amount, that's going to be there. So you have to make it fit into your life and choose what ultimately would work best for you. So that's number one. Renting is just throwing money away. I think that's a myth. Number two, all debt is bad debt. All debt is bad debt. I think that's also a myth. And there's a lot of people out there that believe this to be true. They believe it to be gospel. There's the whole, Dave Ramsey's of the world that are all about debt-free, debt-free, debt-free. I'm not sure if I mentioned on the show before or not, but I have a coworker who's a financial advisor and is a big Ramsey fan, and he and his wife are debt-free, and he's very proud of that. And he takes every chance and every opportunity in, whether it's in a client meeting or talking to other advisors or whatever the case might be, to let people know that he's debt-free. And we were joking around at one point, I think we were texting at this point, and he said something about, financial freedom versus being debt-free, financially free being debt-free, essentially, which I've kind of borrowed from, for those that aren't familiar with Get Rich Education, with my boy Keith Weinhold. Really awesome podcast. And if it wasn't, he basically changed my financial life. And so kudos to him and to that show. I think sometimes some of the shit that he talks about, it can be cheesy and, it's kind of painful to listen to, but at the end of the day, he kind of flipped everything that I knew or thought about debt and real estate investing on its head. And if it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't be doing any real estate investing at all. I'd probably be sitting here with zero syndication, zero rental properties, a paid off house, and a much bigger stock market portfolio, and that's about it. So anyway, where was I going with that? Oh, so his big mantra is financially free beats debt free, and I do believe that. So I was texting with this other coworker, advisor, friend of mine, and he's like, well, he said, I like being both debt free and financially free. Now, I know about his situation because he's told me about his situation before, and I don't want to get too personal on the show. But my response to him was, if you were financially free, you wouldn't be working here. And he's only planning on, staying in the role for maybe a decade or so. But the reason is because he focused a lot of his energy and his time and his efforts on becoming debt-free. Nothing inherently wrong with that in and of itself. However, based on his age and what he has going on, and fortunately for him, he will have a pension, but that won't turn on for over a decade from now. So in the meantime, yes, he does still have some assets, but he wasn't thinking about this idea of financial freedom / quote unquote early retirement, whatever you want to call it, where he could walk away now if he wanted to. Yeah, he'd probably be fine for a little period of time, but he's not ready to walk away forever. So even though he's debt-free, he's not financially free, and there's a big difference. This might surprise some of you, but this is something that I track on our personal balance sheet, and I might be getting a little personal here, and sometimes I do that on the show, sometimes I don't, and we're going to do it today. I don't really give a shit. So you might be surprised to know that we have almost $1 million in debt. Holy fucking shit, right? And when you think about that, it's like, oh my goodness, like that's terrible. That's awful. And years ago, I would have thought the same thing. But that statement in isolation, in and of itself, doesn't really necessarily mean anything. Because when you take that, in our case, and put it up against about $4 million of assets, that gives you a net worth right around $3 million. That's the other side of the equation. And so, there's a difference between having debt in a business or mortgages on real estate versus vehicle loans versus credit card debt versus, the next thing and the next thing. There's a lot of different types of debt out there. If I told you I had almost $1 million of credit card debt, even if it was at 0%, I'd probably want to just jump off a bridge because that's not going to sit well with me. But that's not the case. But if somebody said that were the case for them, I would say, oh, wow, yeah, that person's probably not in the best financial shape, right? So, not all debt is bad. And the last thing I'll say about this is kind of an example that happened not too long ago. This is actually a family member that was out to visit. And I purchased a new vehicle relatively recently, and they were like, oh, this is nice, whatever. And it's not what I would normally buy, the luxury sedan. It's a nice sedan, but it's nothing overly fancy, just one of the basic brands. And they were very surprised. I made a comment, or we were talking about something. They were very surprised to know. They're like, oh, wait, you have a car payment? Like, you have a car payment on this? And I'm like, yeah. And they were just completely shocked because they know that, I do okay. And that was a kind of a foreign concept to them. And they were like, well, why do you have a car payment? And my answer was, well, I value my money and my liquidity at more than 3.99%, which was the promotional rate I was able to get on the new vehicle. And yeah, I could have written a check and been done and paid cash. But to me, that would be financially irresponsible, is probably a strong word, but it wouldn't be the optimal decision in that scenario. I mean, even keeping those funds in a high yield liquid account at today's rates, even after taxes, you can make an argument that it's pretty close to a wash, right? But if you were to invest that money, you could potentially earn an even larger return, right? Is that going to work for everybody? No. There's going to be people that say, hey, cash flow king, you're a fucking idiot, and you should never take a loan on a depreciating asset, and your podcast is going to get 1 star because this is bullshit. And if that's how you feel, well, sorry to hear that. But The reality of it is, as long as you can manage the payments comfortably and you have the liquidity and you have the balance sheet and you're okay with that, then fine. Now, I think it's the idea of having a car payment because you choose to have a car payment is a foreign concept to a lot of people. And some people, just out of principle, would never do it. My coworker advisor buddy would never do it. And he's very proud to tell everybody how they pay cash for cars and da-da-da-da-da. And I'm not saying I won't pay cash for a vehicle in the future. In fact, if it came back and the only loan I could get was, say, double that, let's say it was in the 6s, 7s, or even 8%, right? Double the 3.99 is pretty much 8%. If that were going to be the loan, well, that'd be a tougher decision, right? Because I'm not going to make that on cash. I could make that or potentially more than that on certain types of investments. Then you have to look at, secondary considerations like your liquidity needs and things like that. And does it truly make sense to carry it at 8%, where you could just write a check and be done? And quite frankly, gun to my head, I'd probably say, yeah, 8%, I'd probably write a check. 3.99, 4%, yeah, I'll take the loan, right? So it's going to be different for everybody. But I guess my point in that and saying all that is that the fact that people think all debt is bad debt, and maybe the car loan's not the best example. Mortgages are probably an even better example. That, there are certain types of debt, like high interest consumer debt, like credit cards, that can get you in a world of trouble, right? But there's also fairly low interest rate debt, whether it's a business loan or a mortgage or, in this case, a car loan, whatever the case might be, where it's not necessarily always the end of the world. And, you hear about people out there that are buying cars at fucking 15, 20% like they bought it on a damn credit card. Yeah, that's predatory. That's, you probably have shit credit. That's, you couldn't write a check if you wanted to because you'd never take out a loan at 20% on a car. That's like, okay, you're in a completely different financial, world as far as that goes. And that's probably not the best decision. But as I like to say, banks and financial institutions love to lend money to people that don't need it. And so if you know how to use that appropriately, it can be to your benefit. All right, that's number 2. We're going to go a little bit more quickly through the next few of these here so we can get through all 10. Number 3, you need to be rich to invest. Well, false, not true. And I think a lot of people know this now, but historically speaking, I think a lot of people think that you need to have quite a bit of money in order to start investing. That couldn't be further from the truth, especially today with technology and all the different discount brokerages and platforms that exist out there, and zero fee, zero commission trading abilities or investment abilities. You can definitely get your money working for you at fairly small amounts of money. You don't have to have a gazillion dollars to start with. So that's definitely a myth. But I think historically speaking, a lot of people thought that, you hear people say, well, it takes money to make money. And there might be, a shade of truth to that. But if you're looking to get started, you don't have to necessarily have all the money in the world in order to pull the investment trigger or hit the investment green go button. You can absolutely start very, very small and build it up over time. And most of us, that's what we have to do when we're just getting started. Number 4, this is one of my favorites. Carrying a credit card balance improves your credit score. Bullshit. And I was actually talking to a college class several years ago, just doing a presentation on personal finance to the students. And there was a girl that was in the front row, and I forget exactly when in the presentation this came up, but this particular point came up. And I asked the students, I said, raise your hand if you've ever heard this before. How many of you have heard this before? And several hands in the room went up. And she said, yeah, my grandparents told me that, on my credit card that I should always carry a little bit of a balance. So, I'll use it to buy gas and buy a few packs of gum. And then I'll just make, the minimum payment on it to make sure that I always owe just a little something in order to build my credit. And I was like, holy fucking shit, not true. So you absolutely do not need to carry a balance on a credit card in order to build credit. So that is absolutely a myth. That's one I think that's fairly common out there that a lot of people have heard, and it's just not true. Number 5, you should always buy in bulk to save money. Also, not necessarily true. And don't get me wrong, I love Costco. I love my $1.50, whatever it is, hot dog combo. They've added some new items to the menu over time. Some of those are a little bit more expensive. But, where else could you go for a fucking hot dog and a fountain drink that's refillable for like $2? It's fantastic. But as much as I love Costco, If you're a household of one, depending on what it is, unless you're just buying toilet paper, paper towels, and some drinks or something, you may not necessarily want to do all of your shopping there, because you're probably going to save money in terms of, hey, look, I bought a shit ton of eggs that I'm never going to be able to eat, but don't worry, I saved a little bit of money per egg or something like that, or per dozen. And while that might be true at the outset and on the surface look like a good idea, if you end up not using it and you buy things that are perishable and ultimately you end up having to throw things away, then, are you really saving money? And many people would argue, no, you're actually not. Number 6, you don't need an emergency fund if you have credit cards. What? No, that's absolutely not the case. Now, some people, and I've heard this argument, and I can get on board with part of this argument. It goes something like this. If you have a decent amount of financial assets and you are, let's say, investing in a taxable brokerage account, and you keep a lower balance in, say, a savings account or a combination of checking and savings account, then if a true emergency happens, there's really nothing where you're going to have to run to the bank in the middle of the night to pull out a stack of $100 bills and pay for something. Chances are, if there's a true emergency, you're going to be able to use a credit card. And even if the money's not at that particular moment sitting in a bank account, but instead it's sitting in an investment account, that you would have plenty of time to put in your sell orders in order to raise the cash and transfer that cash to your bank account in order to pay the credit card bill. I have heard that before, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. In fact, I'm not saying that that's what I personally would do, but there's a lot of people that intentionally will keep their liquid cash and bank accounts very lean in an effort to try to, eke out a little bit extra return by investing those funds, knowing that if shit hits the fan and something happens, there's credit cards that they can put something on in the meantime. Now, I will be the first to admit, and again, personal finance is personal, but I feel like I'm okay getting a little personal on the show today, so I'm going to mention this too. I fully understand and realize that I personally don't use credit cards to their optimal point. What does that mean? Well, let's start with what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that I'm paying, and in fact, in my entire life, I'm proud to say I've never paid a penny of credit card interest before. So that's not what I mean at all. What I do mean, though, is what people typically do is, and the optimal way to do it is you would put, your expenses that you're able to on a credit card, and you can do that strategically for points or miles or cash back, and we have other shows about that. We won't get into that today. But you could do that and then wait for the statement to close, and then wait the 3 to 4 weeks that they give you in terms of the grace period, and have it set up for auto pay to automatically pay off the statement balance at the last possible moment and still never pay a penny of interest. That would be the optimal way from a dollars and cents standpoint of utilizing the cards. In my personal opinion, I also think that's, number one, it works well if you're super disciplined and you are in the minority of people that can do that. However, I think for the vast majority of people, at some point, they're probably going to get stuck. They're going to get caught. They're going to forget something, even if it's on auto pay, but they're going to not have the funds to take care of that when the time comes. And that's how a lot of people will get in trouble. Now, I understand that there's an optimal way to do this. However, personally, we use credit cards more like a debit card. We call it clearing cards. I don't even want to necessarily wait most of the time for the statement balance to close before they're paid. So as I'm charging stuff up and I see the numbers start to run up on the card a little bit, I'm not waiting for the statement to close. Yes, they're all on auto pay for the full statement balance as a backstop, as a safety mechanism in case I did forget. But the way that we typically do it is we're clearing them out, a few times a month. And so it's very rare that a card will close with a significant balance on that particular statement. Usually it's at zero. I get a lot of email notifications that will say, hey, your statement's now available. I click on it and it's zero current balance, zero statement balance, zero currently due, because we like to keep them clean. That's just a personal decision. That's what helps us sleep at night. We tried doing it the other way, and I'm not afraid that we're going to get in trouble. I just don't like the mental exercise of knowing that, well, there's this number in the bank account, but there's also that number on the credit card. It makes me, I don't know, just doesn't feel good to me. I like knowing, hey, here's where we're at. Everything's clear. We're good to go. And I understand that I might be leaving a few pennies on the table by doing that. But it's actually kind of comical because, we have, as I mentioned earlier in the show, close to 7 figures of total debt. Most of that is mortgage debt for rental properties and things like that. But, that doesn't bother me in the slightest. But seeing a few $1,000s just chilling on a credit card before the statement closes, I don't like it. I like to keep them clean. I like to zero them out. So that's just a personal thing. But needless to say, and regardless of how you personally choose to handle that, I would not say that your credit card is your emergency fund. It could be your temporary place to pay for an expense, but the money should still be there, whether it's in a traditional bank account or a brokerage account or some sort of, fairly liquid place that you can get at it pretty easily. I don't think that credit cards are a substitute for having an emergency fund. I think that's a recipe for fucking disaster if you think that to be the case. Number 7. You should never touch your retirement accounts until retirement. Wow. It's kind of a loaded one. Some people might disagree with this one. If you asked me, I don't know, a handful of years ago, my opinion on this, I probably would have told you, yeah, I would agree with that. You shouldn't touch your retirement accounts until retirement. And I think for the vast majority of people, in the vast majority of cases, generally speaking, that could still hold true. However, I think if you do it strategically, it actually potentially could work out for the better. What do I mean? Well, I had a client one time who was unexpectedly, she was getting her things in order. Husband had lost his position. They had a temporary lapse in income. She was a pretty high earner. He did okay. Didn't have a ton of savings. Had a couple kids. Their HVAC went out. And they basically were in a little bit of, frantic situation where they needed to get the unit replaced. They did. They took some sort of in-house or, third-party financing through the HVAC company. It was at a double-digit interest rate. She didn't love it. She still had pretty good cash flow, but it wasn't necessarily the best source of financing. She was able to take a loan against her account back then at, I think it was super low, like a 3% interest rate, and then essentially pay it back into the account and knock out the double-digit interest rate on the loan that she had initially taken through the HVAC company. Now, are there some people that would have never done that and they would have said, you know what, I'm just going to pay this off as quickly as I can because I have the excess cash flow to do that. I don't care if it's at a high interest rate. I'm not touching my retirement account. Sure, and I can make an argument either way because you got to look at things like it's not just the difference in interest rates, but also the opportunity cost. You got to look at the plan rules. Some plans, if you were to take a loan against the account, may not let you contribute to the account for a certain period of time. Other plans will allow you to do that. So there's a lot of considerations there, but that was just a situation where that's what she wanted to do, so that's what we did. I might have told this story on the show before. There was a rental that I bought, and it was the only one right now, technically, that I would fucking sell. And I think I mentioned on one of the most recent shows about the guy that was texting me. I still blow his ass up, too, about wanting to buy it. It's a completely unreasonable price. But I actually did take a loan from my 401k plan for the down payment on that property because I wanted to maintain liquidity. And the way that it's structured on the particular plan that I took it from, it basically cost me $50, and then I think the rate is 4% fixed. So again, a very reasonable rate. This is a few years ago when rates were lower, and I pay that back into the account, and the interest goes also into the account. And so the only quote unquote downside, other than the $50 and the opportunity cost of those funds, which have done quite well. But you got to remember, I did this for investment purposes. So the rental, even though it's one of the worst, if not the worst rental that we have, still has its own mechanics in terms of total return. There really wasn't a ton of downside other than double taxation on the interest portion, but that's a negligible amount, and I can prepay it if I want to at any time. But I guess the point is, a lot of people say you should never touch your retirement accounts until retirement. Well, if you had the HVAC situation, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. If you had the rental situation, maybe you would be bold and say, you know what, I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to pass on this. And in hindsight, knowing what I know now, if I had to go back and do it all over again, I probably wouldn't have taken the loan for that particular house. But the one we bought after that was great, and I would take a loan for that house. I would do it again in that situation. But probably a better example than those two is a gentleman that I know here in town who, from a financial standpoint, he had, and it wasn't me, but he had a financial advisor at the time who told him that he was crazy for going into his retirement account and taking money out of his retirement account. And he ended up buying close to, I think, 10 liquor stores in town and, across the neighboring cities, and did phenomenally well for himself. The night we were talking, I think he told me he was worth, upwards of 10 million, something like that. And he's still not really like an old guy. He's still, I'd say fairly middle-aged guy. But he never would have been able to make those investments and buy into those businesses and do what he did if he didn't have a source of capital. And in his particular instance, he happened to take that capital from his retirement plan, which was against his financial advisor's advice at the time. And he kind of, was telling me about how he threw it in his face and told him, hey, look what I did with this, and it's probably better than you would have made for me, and blah, blah, blah. But, so there are situations where, depending on what you're going to be using the money for, where it can make some sense to do it. There's other situations and other people that might do it for things like first-time home buyers. Maybe there's certain hardships that they come across. Your Roth IRA, for example, you can back out your contributions and only your contributions from a Roth IRA and only a Roth IRA, tax and penalty free anytime, any age, any reason. That's different for other Roth types of account. That does not include the growth or the earnings or anything like that. But there are situations where there are either certain types of accounts or certain types of things that will come up, whether it's investment or personal expense, that you may choose to tap your retirement account for. But I don't think that in this one, quite frankly, of all of them, I would say is probably the most debatable. But I don't think it should be an ironclad rule of you should never touch your retirement accounts until retirement. I think that there are some situations where it might be okay. Again, some of you may disagree with that, and that's fine. It's a personal decision. It's not, something that I would do in most situations, and it's not something that you would typically suggest people do in most situations. But depending on what the need is for the funds and the circumstances, it could potentially make sense. So that one, kind of a gray area, but also that's listed here as a myth. Number 8, if you make more money, you'll automatically be financially secure. Obviously not true. In fact, this year, not to boast or anything, but I so far am having a record year. I've made more money this year than I ever have. I've also probably spent close to more money this year than I ever have. And so the old saying, it's not what you make, it's what you keep. We're doing just fine, but I don't think that, you can look at just one side of the equation on the income side and neglect to look at the expense side and think that a higher income automatically makes you more financially secure. Now, in most cases, that is typically going to be the case. In fact, I was listening to a podcast earlier today where the guy actually had a guest on who, and they were talking about this, and basically, even though, I forget exactly how it was said, but even though you have people that earn a high income, then that doesn't necessarily mean that they're automatically financially successful, or that they're automatically going to be financially secure. You can also look at people that don't earn a lot of money, and while some of them do phenomenally well, and the whole millionaire next door concept, I'm not discounting that at all, but a lot of people that are not financially successful, the vast majority of them have a quote-unquote income problem. In other words, a higher income is not going to solve all your problems, but it's certainly going to help, right? You can only cut expenses so much. Theoretically, there's no limit to increasing your income, but you just need to make sure that as your income goes up, even if your expenses go up, that you're keeping a pretty close eye on that as well, and that your expenses, you're not getting caught up in the whole idea of lifestyle creep, right? And just because you're earning more, that you're automatically spending more on certain things. I've said this, I think, before, but I'm driving the most economical car I've ever driven. I'm worth more than I've ever have been. I'm earning more income than I ever have. And I'm okay with that. I'm actually at peace with that. But it's something that I think a lot of people just automatically make the assumption that income is the solution to everything. And while that's certainly going to be the case, for a lot of people. To help you get there, you also have to have your finger on the pulse of the expenses to the extent that's reasonable too. I'm not saying that if your income goes up, you shouldn't raise your expenses. In fact, there's a podcaster that I mentioned earlier in the show that one of his claims, and I kind of get a chuckle out of it when he says it, is he wants to increase his expenses every year. He doesn't want his expenses to go down every year, but he wants his income to increase significantly more than that every year, so that the gap is still widening. And I think that's the mindset that we should be thinking about that through, the lens we should be thinking about that through. All right, I have some numbers for you guys on this one. This might be a little bit of a longer one, but number 9, you should prioritize paying off all debt before investing. And I'm sure many of us have heard this before. Sometimes when you're in the thick of it, it could be hard to really see past this. And so I thought it might be helpful to run some numbers, and I took some notes on my notepad here. I had some fun with the loan calculator and the time value of money calculator, and I got to see if I can go back and find it. I got way too many fucking tabs open on my phone here. I am recording this on Sunday, September 28th, so definitely got the sports betting apps running, and having some fun with that. Here we go. Okay, number 9. All right, so the number that I'm going to use here, just to keep it nice and round numbers, is a $100,000 loan. And I'm going to assume, let's say, that this is a student loan for somebody, okay? And I went ahead and Googled, what's the federal subsidized interest rate right now? And a quick Google search told me that any federal loans that are subsidized that were dispersed after July 1st of 2025, I forget what the end date was, it was sometime in 2026, that the interest rate was 6.39%. And I thought that was interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's kind of a middle of the road interest rate, and it gets in the gray area. Normally when you're talking about paying down debt versus investing, everyone's going to be different. But when you get in the 5 to 7, in some cases 5 to 8% range, that oftentimes is a gray area for a lot of people where you can make an argument either way. So I thought it was interesting for that reason. I also thought it was interesting because it is the actual, according to Google, rate that somebody would get right now on a subsidized loan. And if we're going to use a student loan as an example, I thought that was timely. And then finally, I thought it was interesting because normally when I do these time value money calculations, I am using a 7% internal rate of return, or essentially, static, deterministic type of forecasting where we're using 7% each and every year. And some people are quick to remind me, well, cash flow king, if you looked at the S&P 500, markets go up more than that. Yeah, 7% is a net inflation adjusted number. So that's pretty close to the 6.39. And at first glance, you might think, well, this is probably going to be pretty close to a wash. And you might be surprised to hear how some of these numbers played out. And again, everyone's situation is different, right? There's going to be people that pay off sooner, people that pay off later. I think when I was looking at it, it was typically a 10 to 25 year repayment. So I'm going to try to look at this from a longer term perspective. Somebody has a $100,000 student loan that was dispersed recently. They're going to be paying 6.39% interest, once they've moved on and it's no longer subsidized. And we're going to assume that they're going to pay that over a 25-year term. So with that, putting that into a quick little loan calculator here, we came out with a payment of roughly $668 a month. So I'm going to assume that this person has a quote-unquote extra, if you want to call it that, $1,000 a month. So the two scenarios are: make the minimum student loan payment, which here is $668, and invest the difference, or take the entire $1,000 and put it towards the student loan, don't invest, and pay off that loan sooner. And then once that loan's paid off, then invest that entire $1,000 a month and see where we end up, right? This is sort of an overly simplistic example, and it may not sound that way because this is kind of hard to do in an audio format like a podcast. But I'm trying to get this as close to a reasonable comparison as I can. So once again, number 9, pay off all debt before investing is a myth. You got a $100,000 student loan at 6.39% interest for 25 years. Your payment is $668 a month, okay? So the first part of the scenario is, if we pay this thing over 25 years, we just pay the $668 a month, then we could certainly do that. And then what we'll do is take that additional $332. Remember, we got $1,000 to work with, so we're paying $668, which is our minimum payment on the loan, and we're investing the $332 a month, and we're going to do that for 25 years. At the end of 25 years, again, assuming a 7% rate, the loan is gone because we've naturally paid that off, and we have a little over $270,000 in investment value in that account. All right. Now, I'm going to come back to that because there's a little twist here at the end. But that's the initial scenario. Normal payoff for 25 years, make the minimum monthly payment, invest the difference. Now, the second scenario to compare that to is the accelerated payoff. So now, instead of just making that minimum $668 a month payment on the student loan and investing the difference, we're going to put the entire $1,000 a month towards the student loan. We're investing nothing because we're under the belief, quote unquote, that we need to pay off all of our debt before investing. So what happens if we do that? Well, instead of paying it off in 25 years, we would now pay it off in 17 years. So 8 years fewer, right? Well, now to get us to the end of 25 years, if we've paid off the student loan at the end of 17 years, our current investment balance is zero because we haven't invested anything. We used all the money to pay off the loan. Now, for the next 8 years to get us to that initial 25-year time period, we're going to take that entire $1,000 we had to play with, and we're going to invest it for 8 years under the same assumptions at 7%. At the end of that time period, right, for the total of 25 years, a 17-year payoff and the 8-year subsequent investment, we have no loan and almost $129,000 in investments. Now, right there, under those assumptions, we already have approximately $140,000 more under the normal payoff scenario where it took us the 25 years. And you might say, well, that's great, but how much interest did we save by paying it off early, yada, yada, yada? The answer is a little over $57,000. So now we take the 140 and we back out the 57, $83,000. So we're still $83,000 to the good by doing the normal payoff and paying the additional interest. And you might say, yeah, well, that sounds cool, but over that time period, it's not enough money for me to worry about. So fuck it, I'm just going to pay the debt off before I invest. Okay, fine. But let me add this wrinkle in at the end. So when we have those balances at the end of that initial 25-year period, the 270 under the normal payoff and the 129 under the accelerated payoff, 129,000 versus 270,000. What happens if we don't invest another penny and we let each of those amounts just ride for 15 more years under that assumption of 7%? Well, under the accelerated payoff method, at the end of a total of year 40, we're going to have over $367,000. Sounds pretty good, right? But under the normal payoff, where we initially had the additional funds, we had about $140,000 more in that scenario. If we let that amount, that 270 and change, ride for 15 more years, where do we end up? And the answer is over $770,000 at the end. So we're talking about a $400,000 difference where we would have more money doing the normal payoff, but if we did the accelerated payoff, we would have saved $57,000. So what would you rather do? Have $400,000 more or save $57,000 and have less? So that's just one example with some of those numbers, but you should prioritize paying off all debt before investing. Definitely don't think that's true. And to make an even more drastic example, and I didn't run numbers on this, I don't really think I need to, I think this is pretty intuitive for most people, that if you have a retirement plan at work, especially one that provides an employer match of any kind, that's essentially free money. But sometimes it will require you to make contributions to get that match if it's not an employer automatic contribution. And you should absolutely do that, even if you're paying off certain types of debt, because why would you turn down free money, especially money that's going to grow and compound for you, presumably for decades? That makes an even stronger case against that you should prioritize paying off all debt before investing. So number 9, you should prioritize paying off all debt before investing is a myth. Finally, number 10, personal finance advice is one size fits all. Myth. Because I think there's a lot of general guidelines and concepts and things that are going to work for certain individuals. What makes personal finance so interesting, so fascinating, and so exciting, in my opinion, is the fact that it truly is personal, and what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for everybody. And if there's one thing I've learned about personal finance that I believe, both personally and professionally, it's this. You need to look at some general principles and guidelines that are directionally correct to move you in the right direction towards your goals based on your own facts and circumstances. However, the optimal decision for you in terms of maximum enjoyment, fulfillment, and quite frankly, peace of mind may be different than the optimal financial choice. And I think the best way to explain that, even though it's a small example, is what I mentioned about the credit cards and how we choose to clear them all the time versus letting them pile up until the statement closes and then dragging it out and doing the auto pay of the statement balance a few weeks later. Just mentally, even though it's not the most financially optimal, mentally, that is what works for us. And when I say directionally correct, the underlying thing there would be, well, in both of those scenarios, you're not paying interest on those credit cards. So whether you choose to pay it a little bit early versus dragging it out every possible day you can during the grace period, the financial impact of that is likely going to be negligible, especially as it compares to your mental bandwidth. I hope that makes sense. All right. Those are our 10 personal finance money myths for today. A little bit of a different format for the show. If you guys liked it, or if you didn't, or if you have feedback on any of the 10, feel free to reach out to the show, realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. We appreciate you listening, and we will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.